Working Cows Podcast, Episode 11.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
This episode of the Working Cows Podcast is brought to you by Padlock Ranch Supply. Check out their website at padlockranchsupply.com. They understand the needs of ranchers and farmers, whether you need to take care of your livestock, horses, or even building supplies. They have everything you need to work your cows, whether that be the chute you work them through, the water you bring them to, or the tools you use to make them go up that chute a little bit faster. So check out their website at padlockranchsupply.com. This episode is also brought to you by ChrisWilliamsAudio.com. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, making your product sound great is crucial. Don't settle for audio that's less than professional. No matter what type of audio service you need, Chris Williams and his team have got you covered. Head on over to ChrisWilliamsAudio.com for all your audio production needs. Hello, everybody. Really excited about this episode. I might have buried the lead a little bit in the close of the best of episode, but we've got Trey Patterson on the show today. Really excited about the conversation that we're going to be able to have with him. Coming up next week, we will release an episode on stockmanship with Kurt Pate. And then the week after that, we will release an episode with Dave Pratt from Ranching for Profit. And then to round out January, we will release an episode with Roland Cruz. But today, as I said, we are talking with Dr. Trey Patterson. Dr. Patterson served as an extension beef specialist for South Dakota State University for 5 years. Since 2005, Trey has been with the Padlock Ranch Company, based out of Ranchester, Wyoming. He held the position of Chief Operations Officer until 2014. Trey now holds the position of President and CEO. Well, Dr. Patterson, thank you for joining us today on the Working Cows Podcast. I'd like to start off by giving you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself and talk about maybe your history and the history of the production that you're a part of on the Padlock Ranch, and then we'll dive into our topic today.
Well, great, Clay. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. My name's Trey Patterson. I'm with the Padlock Ranch. I've been with the company about 12 years. I'm currently serving as the CEO and president. My background is one of maybe a little different than some in ranching. I was on faculty at South Dakota State University for a period of time before I came over to the Padlock Ranch, and excited to talk to you today about heifer development.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I think it's a pretty big lever that we can push as far as an opportunity to maybe increase the profitability of our operations if we can develop heifers in a little bit more efficient way. So I think maybe that might be a good place to start out, is kind of talking about what some of the conventional wisdom tells us about heifer development.
Well, I think conventional wisdom always tends to lead us towards maximum. And that is maximum reproduction, maximum size, and all those things that are associated with that. And so, one of the things that we want to challenge is really what is optimum and not maximum.
Sure. And what are some of the things that you have found as far as the difference between optimum and maximum as it relates to heifer development specifically?
Well, I think back up just a little bit, if it's okay.
Sure.
And just visit about why this is important. Because as we look at most ranch businesses, depreciation is amongst their largest cost. Depreciation is that cost associated with replacing your herd, or a big part of it is. Of course, there's depreciation on machinery and other things. But replacing that factory every year has an expensive cost, and whether you cash that out within a year or you capitalize it and depreciate it over time, it's large. And there is a lot of leverage in being able to reduce that cost and improve the long-term profitability of the business. So as we look at heifer development programs, we want to consider keeping our development cost as reasonable as we can. Now, obviously, reproduction is important, but if your costs are low enough in the development process, failed reproduction in a yearling is not necessarily a negative towards profitability. In fact, if your production costs are low enough in developing the calf to a year of age where you could breed them, if they do turn up open, they can still be a profitable animal to sell in the fall. And so it's looking at that relationship between cost and reproduction. Now, interestingly, when we have used systems to reduce costs in heifer development, we have not seen any reduction in reproductive rates or these first-year breed-ups or ability to conceive to AI. And so even while we're aware of that risk, if they're developed to lighter weights, for instance, we haven't seen it. And there's research out of the University of Nebraska that supports that as well, that maybe cattle have changed over time since some of the original research was done looking at target weights for heifers. We've got a lot of fertility and earlier puberty in these cattle, and we may not have to have them at 65, 70% of their mature weight when we breed them to get adequate reproduction. And so it's a combination of looking at the cost and then what you need for replacements and building a program that sets you up for long-term profitability. And again, remember, these are costs that you're spending every year, because most of us, unless we're in a liquidation phase, are replacing a significant portion, or at least a portion of our herd annually.
Yeah, we had Aaron Berger on episode 6 of the Working Cows podcast, and he talked specifically about cow depreciation and some different ways that we could go about managing it. And he was saying some of the same things that you're saying about if you can develop heifers at a low enough cost, she's still a marketable female, even if she falls out as a yearling. And what we might want to look at doing is pouring more of our resources into those 2-year-olds coming 3s, so that we don't lose those, because that's an expensive one to lose when you have them developed into the herd, and then you lose that coming 3-year-old. When she doesn't breed up, that can be an expensive deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've actually done some economics on that. I was part of a symposium a decade ago that was on this topic, and I worked with an economist who put together an analysis on that, Dick Clark from University of Nebraska. And what he showed is that if reproduction were to go down in the yearling and you have a lower cost of production, that animal could still be profitable. But if reproduction failed as a 2-year-old of their second breed up coming 3, or a 3-year-old, then it raised your total cost and likely into areas where that particular animal is not profitable anymore, because you've got all those expenses into them on the front end, and yet you only get one calf out of them, and then they're out of the system. So obviously that's related to marketing, how you market young open cows and such. But we all know that those are typically lighter animals. They're past the maturity age. They've had a calf, or they're not going to be feeder cattle prices. So it's a huge leverage point focused on the young cow. When I talk about young cows, I'm thinking the heifer calf, through a 3-year-old cow. How we use our resources wisely in the first 2 to 3 years of that animal's existence is really important, I think, to our bottom line.
Sure. There will be a link on the show notes page for this episode at workingcows.net/11, and we will have a link to an article there called Heifers at Any Cost, which is some of where I've been doing the research, and that's an article that's linked from the Padlock Ranch website, which will also be linked at that show notes page. But there's some interesting nuggets there, and kind of touching on what we've been talking about thus far. There's a quote from Wayne Fascholds: "We think it's important or it's critical that heifer development be approached from an economic standpoint, not simply a production-based standpoint. And that kind of goes along with what we've been touching on thus far of a systems approach to how we go about looking at the economics of developing heifers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You bet. So one of the ways that we've applied this in our system to reduce cost is to take heifers that we're developing for replacements and run those animals on native range during the winter with some supplementation. And so being able to do that, you obviously keep your costs down, depending on your cost of grass, right? I mean, that's land has become a more significant cost in everybody's structure, I think, especially if you're going out and acquiring new properties by lease or acquisition. But nonetheless, in most systems, in our system, we can use native range grass quite a bit cheaper than we can develop them inside the feedlot, for instance. And with that reduced cost, we also have reduced performance over the winter. They're not necessarily gaining 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds a day throughout the winter. They are growing frame, but we found that those heifers during the wintertime, they're pretty good foragers, and they're actually less sensitive to snow and severe weather than a young bred cow in the wintertime. And so when you allocate grass, you might consider, and one thing that we've considered is using some of that for heifer calves, and then maybe if you have to feed something in its place, maybe feeding the young cow some hay for a while during the winter. You get a better return for that investment in that feed than on the heifer calf. They do pretty good. And the other thing we wonder is, what are we, from a behavioral standpoint, what are we doing to train those heifers to be able to forage in the wintertime and make a living on native range in the winter? I think the opportunity is there to build a better cow to fit an extensive system by allowing that calf to graze out, and it cuts cost. Now, one thing you have to be aware of, in our system, we do not calve until May, so we've got a period of green grass prior to breeding, and those animals will compensate a large portion of that weight difference from their feedlot developed counterparts during the spring and early summer. Now, an operation that calves earlier and does not have that may have to provide somewhat of a higher level of feed resource in the wintertime than we are. We're really able to rough those heifers, but nonetheless, the research shows you can do that, and you can do it much more modestly than what, in terms of cost, than what you can do in the feed yard or in a commercial heifer development system, and still get good reproduction. We can still challenge the paradigm that they have to be 65% of their mature body weight, and I think research and our experience has shown that that's really true. They don't have to be, but your system can also be designed to build some safeguards in there, like calving those heifers a little bit later with the cows. And I know there's a lot of folks that like to calve the heifers early, so the 2-year-olds have a better opportunity to rebreed. I really contend that if your young cow management is correct, and you got plenty of feed in the summertime, and you've got those heifers bred early, and maybe that's the key, Clay, is getting the animals with the heifers that you are keeping, is getting those bred in a fairly tight window up at the front of the season, and that really helps your second breed up with those animals, I think, as much as anything. And you have to be careful if you're calving heifers early too, ahead of your cows. If you're not weaning them early, they're lactating longer and can get pretty thin going into that next winter. So lots of considerations, but that's really what you're talking about from a system standpoint, is trying to put all that together. And everybody's system is different, and what fits in one operation may not fit in another one. But I still think we should all be continually challenging ourselves. Is there a better way to do this? Is there a more economical approach that we can take? And again, I think that we have more leverage in these young cattle in terms of young females entering the herd than just about any area that we've got through that production system.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you bring up some points that I would like to hit. I'm gonna ask you a couple more questions. We're gonna take a quick break, and then we'll come back, and we're gonna talk about developing heifers to a lower percentage of body weight and developing heifers on range. Some of the challenges and some of the advantages that go along with that. But you brought up a point about training them to fit your system, and it brought to my mind a question. When we're investing in those heifers who have already had a calf, they're coming 3-year-olds, and we're trying to get them bred again. And you talked about maybe putting them into the feedlot. I guess those are already bred cows, but is that something that we want to avoid losing those? So we are willing to invest a little bit more time and effort into making sure they do get rebred, as opposed to the heifer calves who are out on native range. Is that kind of fit into what you guys have been seeing and your strategy, that you're trying to invest a little bit more into those more expensive to depreciate out cows?
Well, I think yes, it's just an allocation of your resources. So the concept, the premise that we're working on with that is that ideally, right, we would like everything to be grazing out. But if we've got a limited amount of grazable feed and we have to choose which group to feed, I think we have more leverage in feeding the young bred cow, the bred heifer, than we do feeding the heifer calf that's in development. And so if we allocate those resources that way, I think we can reduce our heifer development costs, which reduces the cost to replace an animal into your herd, reduces depreciation, but reallocating a portion of those resources that you saved in that process to the young cow to make sure once she's bred, we get her bred again through that tough time in her life, that can be a paying proposition, much more so than pumping the feed into a heifer calf so you can brag about having a 95% breed up on your heifers, for instance. Maybe you don't achieve 95%. Maybe you have a short breeding season and you've developed them out and they're lower than that, but still the cost to produce a bred heifer is lower. And if the opens are profitable, there's not a lot of risk in in-failed reproduction. And again, the data shows and our experience shows we're not really seeing the failed reproduction anyway, so it's kind of a no-brainer in our system. As far as your comment on training cows, we haven't validated that. That is an assumption that we're making, just observing the behavior of those cattle that are grazing outside, that we're teaching them at a young age to go out and make a living on grazed forage. And the first time that they have to do that in the wintertime is not when they're packing a calf, which is a tough time nutritionally for a young cow that's still growing, that's got a calf inside. And if that's the first winter that she's ever spent out, that may be asking a lot. And how many of us do that? We've done that. You develop cattle in the yard, you get them nice and fleshy, you get them bred, you get a good breed up, you run them on your best grass that next summer, you get a calf out of them, and then all of a sudden you wean them and you kick them out and say, okay, now you're a cow. Good luck with that. And we wonder why we have lower reproduction rates in young cows. I think there's some things we can do looking at it from the whole system aspect that we believe we can improve that. And we have. I mean, our data has shown that we've improved reproduction in young cows using some of those techniques.
Very helpful. Thank you. We're talking to Dr. Trey Patterson of the Padlock Ranch today on the Working Cows podcast. We're going to take a quick break to thank our sponsors, and we will be right back. This episode has been brought to you in part by ChrisWilliamsAudio.com. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, don't settle for audio that's less than professional. Head on over to ChrisWilliamsAudio.com for all your podcasting, music production, and film audio needs. This episode is also brought to you by Kamak Ranch Supply. Check out their website at KamakRanchSupply.com. And we're back with Trey Patterson from the Padlock Ranch. We're talking about heifer development today, and some of the basic principles that he has shared thus far with us are the principles of developing heifers to a lower percentage of body weight, mature body weight, and then also developing heifers on native range. So what are some of the challenges that come along with developing heifers to a lower percentage of body weight?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is just making sure you don't overdo it. That I always think I want cattle on a plane of nutrition where they're maybe not gaining a lot at times, but during the winter time if you're a ways out from breeding, but they're still on a positive plane. And I don't think that we want to insinuate from this conversation that you could run those cattle out of feed and have them losing weight. I think that would be detrimental. I think you want them on a positive plane of nutrition. Just maybe doesn't have to be as positive as we once believed that it has to be. And if you're talking about wintering cows out, of course there's challenges with weather. But again, there's the requirements for a 600-pound heifer, 550-pound heifer in the wintertime. She doesn't have a calf. She's not lactating. Her maintenance requirements are not very high. It doesn't take, a lot of nutrition to keep them on a positive plane. And the other thing about it, though, to mitigate the weather risk is it's fairly easy to remedy on a heifer calf if weather does get bad. They're relatively easy to gather. We typically run them in areas we can get to should we need to provide some more supplemental feed, which has been rare that we've had to go in and feed any hay to them because they will forage through the snow. But those events happen. We all know that in the northern plains and the northern Rockies. But they're a group of animals that, if you had to, they're not hard to get on a truck and move too. So I think you can mitigate those risks with just some standard, disaster planning without putting yourself at a lot of risk of reproduction. And the other thing is you've got some time, right? I mean, if you take a bred cow, say a bred heifer that's grazing out on range, and she starts slipping a lot of condition in the wintertime, it's tough to turn that around. It takes a lot of resources because her requirements are high. As she nears calving, she's going through that first lactation in early summer with a heifer calf. You've got more management leeway, maybe is the way to put it, because you can always, if you say, man, I messed up and they were losing weight, well, you've got some time to remedy that prior to breeding to get them back in a positive state.
Sure. What are some of the advantages or some of the benefits that you guys have been seeing from developing heifers to a lower percentage of mature body weight?
Well, I think the real advantage is just reduction in cost, and that's really it. I mean, we haven't seen a lot of negatives, and it's been a reduction in cost. Again, I think you can take that to an extreme, and dystocia could be an issue. So it's involved in your bull selection and in calving. How that affects your calving time with these heifers and such. But yeah, I think the biggest advantage is in cost savings.
Sure. What about developing heifers on range? Any challenges there that you guys, you talked about some of them, especially the winter. Any other challenges that you have noticed?
No, not really. Young cattle tend to crawl out of fences more and those kind of things. So keeping them in can be a little more challenging, but we really haven't, in our experience with it, had any real problems with it.
And I think we've talked about some of the advantages of developing heifers on native range related to making them a better forager as a cow. Are there any other advantages that you see as far as developing heifers on native range is concerned?
Well, I think you hit on the big ones. It's in the cost. It's in we think that we're affecting behavior of the animal. We haven't been able to validate that. It'd be really interesting to see some behavioral research on that, long term. I think just looking at the cattle, they look bright, they look healthy, and we're providing some protein supplementation. And man, they really do good on summer grass. And so your ability to take the available nutrients that's in the forages that we're offered in the spring and early summer and convert that into cheap gain, you can take a lot more advantage of that with an animal that's not been pushed hard through the wintertime.
Some of the benchmarks that you mentioned, or I guess what are some of the benchmarks that we should talk about as far as percentage of body weight and the most beneficial target body weight size to shoot for when we're talking about developing heifers?
I think you you need to understand what mature cows weigh, and I don't think you want those heifers incredibly light. I think you probably at least want them somewhere around 55% of their mature weight at breeding time and on a positive plane of nutrition prior to breeding and during breeding. But we don't spend a lot of time worrying about what that weight and what that percentage is. Is the animal in adequate breeding condition, and are we getting the results from it? And so it's really not even a metric we look at, to be real honest with you. And sometimes those animals that we've slowed down during the winter compensate on spring grass, and they're not very much lighter than the ones that we had in the feed yard and fed a prescribed ration, to gain 1.5 or 1.75 pounds a day or whatever we choose to do there. So I think I don't get hung up on that as much as just make sure it's not too low. And I think most cattlemen can discern, if an animal's in adequate breeding condition. You don't want them rail thin. You don't want them losing weight. And certainly you don't want them, less than 55% of their mature weight. We're typically above 55%. They may not be at 70, but we're above that just because of their performance on early summer grass.
Right, but there's not a lot of investment to get there, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right.
Gotcha. What about marketing the open heifers? That seems like an important piece of this.
One of the things that we found is some of the best performing cattle that we have are those that are coming off of grass in the fall. These yearlings, and I think being able to hit that market time ahead of the calf run, if you can get cattle preg tested early and get those cattle sold, you can beat the fall pressures in the market. There's a demand for some larger yearling cattle that are going to gain fast. They're going to hit the holiday kind of market for, when we see demand for primals go up because of the Christmas and such. And so there's a market for them at that time. And we've also retained ownership on them. And those cattle gain and convert and grade really well off of grass, so they're profitable to feed.
Very, very much appreciate your time today. It's been a profitable discussion, I think. Just some real practical things that we can take back to our own ranches and implement in a way, I think, that can help economically as well as from a production standpoint. So any other nuggets regarding heifer development, things that maybe I don't know how old this article was, but maybe things that you guys have learned since this article was published, or other things that we haven't covered here today?
Well, I think at some point, all of us, we've got to decide, are we going to allocate some grass for heifers? And if so, where is that going to be? And here's the real question: is it's really turnover on the ranch. So one of the challenges is if you got more of your yearlings grazing out for a longer time during the year, that replaces feed for something, usually other cows. So we talk about quite a bit the importance of having your ranch optimally stocked to dilute your overhead cost. And so it can be somewhat of a challenging systems question: is, are we going to reduce our herd size to free up grass to run these heifers, or are we going to make some other arrangements? And those could be leasing additional grass, or it may be feeding some young cows in place of grazing them out, so you make some room for the heifers. In our system, we've leaned towards the latter, where we're maybe putting some more feed in that bred heifer and have not reduced our herd size. But I'm just, guess what I'm saying is I'm very much aware that most ranches, including us, just aren't sitting on an abundance of unused grass that we're trying to figure out what to do with. And whether it's worth reducing your herd size or not will be something you'll have to wrestle with a little bit, or just allocating your harvested feed use a little differently.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you, and we will make sure that people are aware of the resources that are on the padlockranch.com website. Are there any other resources that you would like to make people aware of as far as heifer development is concerned, new research or anything like that?
Well, I think some of the research that Dr. Funston has done out of North Platte, Nebraska, needs some consideration, because they've used some of these concepts in spring-born heifers rather than the later calving season that we have. And so I think there's merit in looking at those resources from University of Nebraska.
Very, very much appreciate that. So thank you for turning us on to those things, and maybe we'll get some of those specific resources and also link them at workingcows.net/11. One more thing from the article. It says crossbred heifers can reach puberty and breed if developed at 55% of mature weight at breeding, but it isn't clear if purebred heifers would respond the same way. Is that still kind of your understanding, or is there any new information there as far as purebred heifers are concerned?
I'm not aware of any new research in that regard. There sure may be, but I think if you take some steps towards trying to reduce costs in heifer development, you can take some small steps and see what it's doing to your reproduction and such. And I would intuitively I would think that there are purebred animals, or predominantly one breed, that are going to respond similarly. We know we get a hybrid vigor boost from these crossbred animals that you may not get in your purebreds, but that does not necessarily mean that you can't cut cost on a purebred operation. I think just remember that if your costs are high in development, then reproduction is really important, because the more you get bred, the cheaper your cost if selling opens is not profitable. The lower the cost, the less important that overall reproductive rate is to the economics. Now, there's a practical consideration, is that we need enough heifers to replace the cows leaving the herd or stock the ranch appropriately, but that could be manipulated somewhat with the number of animals that you retain.
Very, very helpful. Very practical information. Thank you. I think that's a good bow on this episode, and we can package and deliver it confidently now. So thank you for your time today, Dr. Patterson.
You bet. I was glad to visit with you.
So much good stuff there with Dr. Trey Patterson of the Padlock Ranch. If you wouldn't mind sharing that episode, I think it was a good one for a lot of people to start thinking a little bit differently about how they handle heifer development. If you want to support the show beyond sharing it, beyond subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show, there are some ways you could do that. The first one I'll tell you about is an Amazon wish list of podcasting gear that I would like to have just to make the podcast that much better. So if you want to go ahead and look at the show notes page, workingcows.net/11. There will be a link to a Amazon wish list of things that I would like to have just to make this podcast that much better. So if you want to support the show in that way, you can go ahead and do that. Thanks.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.